So tonight is session 5 for the Trellis and the Vine. This is the old version of the book. If anyone's ever seen this one, I'm sure they've got some updated versions, but it's been a pretty good book, I think. I know some of you guys have picked it up and read it, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It's got a lot of wisdom in it, and so we're picking back up with that tonight. And I do video every session of this, and it's on YouTube. It's not Facebook, so Bev puts it in the bulletin on Sundays. And if you go to that, you can look up and see what the video was for the previous week. But we also have the other ones for the weeks prior. So if you want to watch any of those or listen to any of those, you can type that in, and it'll pull up that specific video. And I think it's helpful. And I hope others think it's helpful as well. But we're picking up in chapter 9 tonight, and just as a matter of recapping what we've talked about, does anyone want to try to say what we've talked about? Like, what could you summarize? Some main ideas, maybe? Like, what is this book emphasizing, perhaps?
The difference between the church and the structures.
Yeah. So the structures of the church would be what?
Like Sunday school, things like the building itself.
Yeah, and they refer to that in the book as the trellis. So those are the physical things of the church. Like your actual building is a structure that supports the work of the church. Sunday school is a program that supports the work of the church. What would be some other ones? Your business meetings are things that occur that supports the work of the church. Now let me ask you this question: what is the work of the church?
Discipleship.
Yeah, discipleship. So it kind of splits into two things there. It is to help individuals come to know the Lord. So it's evangelistic, right? You want people to get saved. You want to introduce them to the Lord. And then after that, it's not, the Bible never says you just sit down and do nothing. It is you grow in your knowledge of the Lord to become more like Christ. And so that's discipleship. So those two things together in the church are the work of the church, and they refer to that as vine work. And so what's interesting, I think, about this book is that they go together. The trellis, the structure of the church, the building, the programs, the different things like that support the vine work. Now, what happens when the emphasis is only on the trellis? It doesn't grow, right? If you don't take care of the vine, and if you don't take care of your flowers, they kind of get unruly, don't they? You know, I don't know any flower that doesn't. So
Mine's artificial.
Dennis did say he wanted to put fake flowers out front. So I said that'd be great for when it snows. We can say we just have flowers at the church year round, in the snow even. But so anyway, so yeah, I mean, so they go together, right? They support one another. Now, of the two, what is the most important? Is it the trellis or is it the vine? It's the vine, right? But what is one of the, without intentionality, where does oftentimes the attention drift to?
To the trellis.
Now, why is that?
It's easier.
The trellis work is easier, right? It's easy to show up for business meetings to talk about finances and different things like that. It's easy to show up for a Sunday morning and sit in the pew and just listen to the pastor preach and then go home and say, well, I've checked off my box for the week, right? It's easy to, if you come to Sunday school and participate in those things. But when you do vine work's more personal, it's more relational, it's more face-to-face. It requires a lot, doesn't it? How can you be personal with somebody if you're not willing to put walls down? How can you have relationships with someone unless you take time to do those things? And our world that we live in today fights against all that, right? And so, this book is addressing these types of things. And because as a church, our purpose is the vine work. Our purpose is to do the things that God has set us out to do. The world doesn't want us to. So we as humanity drift to the easier path. And so we got to be aware of what that is. Is there anything else that's talked about so far? Am I doing good?
Yes.
Okay. What is something else you think maybe can be asked to that?
It's not about the numbers.
It's not about the numbers, right? Because they look at growth, right? We have two different ways of looking at growth. We look at growth as numerical growth. Oh, I got 200 people in the church. That's wonderful. Well, out of those 200 people, how many of them are actually being discipled? Well, that becomes a problem, right? So numbers are good, but only in context of how the people are being discipled in the process. So, if you got people in the church who are disciplers, who are making disciples of others, and you've got numbers because of that, then that's a good thing. But if you have numbers because you got flash and bang, smoke and mirrors, all that stuff, that's not a good thing. And so they talk about that distinction as well. One of them doesn't have very much longevity, the other one has a lot of longevity. So, what else? Anything else stand out that anyone can remember?
Well, you may also lose some
Yeah.
members.
Yeah.
Who go on to.
Yeah, there's a couple implications. When you have good spiritual growth and people are maturing in discipleship, and then as a church you're wanting to do what God has called you to do, and you realize, say for example, there's a fictitious down the road called whatever you want to name it, and they don't have a church, and you say, hey, look, we want to partner with the Southern Baptist to plant a church down there. Then they're going to say, well, do you have anybody from your church you're willing to send? Well, by golly, yes, I do. I've got 5 people, or I've got 10 people, and you send your best. Now, why is that hard for you? Because you're sending your best, right? To start something somewhere else. But that's what the Bible's calling for as well, for us to do, to send out, to prepare. Now, the other part of it is when you get serious about discipleship, when you get serious about what God has called the church to be, and you quit saying things that tickle people's ears, people might do what? Leave. And then you say, oh, look, I can't believe those individuals left. And that could be hard too. But, in many ways, that could be God pruning the bush too, pruning the vine. The Bible talks about that. So, and this book talks about all those things as well. And so, it's kind of a good thing to talk about, and sometimes it can be hard to talk about, but this is the reality that we face. So we're going with chapter 9 tonight because we kind of summarized most everything. We're talking about training some here. We need both the trellis and the vine for God's purposes for the church. And the most important of the two is the vine work. It's the spiritual growth work that, and because vine work is the most important work, we've also discussed that it's not just certain people who are responsible for the vine work, it's who? All of us. All of us are responsible for the vine work within the church. Now, that doesn't mean that we all have the same job. It doesn't mean that we all have the same position. We all have we're like cogs in the wheel. We all have different things that we can do and we can work towards. And we discussed that a little bit. Like, someone might be very good about being out and about and talking to someone about Jesus, right? Someone else might be really good at follow-up, and someone else might be really good at these things. And all those things working together is accomplishing the vine work. Now in chapter 9, if you read the book, they start off within, I think the second paragraph. They say, let's go back to the pastor. Let's go back to this pastor of this fictitious church they have in this book. And they want to, according to the authors of this book, considering this fictitious pastor, this pastor wants to train and equip his members to be vine workers. He wants to do what he's actually called to do, to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And you can say, well, how does that happen? How does the pastor equip saints for the work of the ministry? And that's a fair question, right? How does that supposed to happen? And you may say, you may ask this question, well, why would you even ask that question in the first place? And they say this in the book. They say that, you at the same time that he wants to equip saints for the work of the ministry, what is the pastor dealing with, according to chapter 9?
A lot of other things.
Yeah.
Follow-up.
Yeah. I copied it basically from the book, but what they say is he's swamped with work, which is made up of preaching commitments, pastoral crises, and anything else that happens in the church. And if you know anything about pastoral work, anything happens whenever it wants to happen, right? There is no 8 to 5, middle of the night phone calls or whatever, and things of that nature. So there again, the pastor in this book, the example that they give, he says he has about, I think, 130 members is what they're saying. And so how can he possibly disciple all 130 members, equip them for the work of the ministry when he can barely take care of 10? And I wrote in my notes, that's a really good question, isn't it? All right, because logistically that's not going to happen. But in order for it to start, it's got to start somewhere. So where does it start? Where can this process begin? And so to kind of give an idea, they look at Paul in the New Testament. Paul, the epitome of being a missionary. Paul, according to these authors, and biblically they're correct, he had a band of brothers. He had a group of people that was surrounding him. In the New Testament, there's up to 100 names that are associated with Paul. So the man was connected with people, right? And of those 100 people, there was 36 that you could say that they were his close partners or who were co-laborers with him. Because he talks about them, right? Paul calls these individuals one of two things. He either calls them a fellow worker or what?
Minister.
A minister, right? A minister of the gospel. It doesn't mean that they're a pastor. It just means they're ministering the gospel. And then Paul, he describes himself as one who labors for Christ in the work of the Lord. So when we think about someone who labors, what do we think about? If you have a job where you're a day laborer, what's that mean?
You do the grunt work.
Yeah, you're doing grunt work. You're out working. You might be someone working on the road somewhere for VDOT or whatever. You're someone who's doing the heavy lifting and whatever. And so Paul says, I'm a heavy lifter. I'm a laborer, right? And then he says, these individuals are co-laborers with me. So what's he saying there? What's he implying? If I'm a laborer and people are laboring with me, he's describing a team concept, right? That's what Food Line wants to emphasize when you have those morning meetings. You have morning meetings at Food Line? Or meetings at all whatsoever? Walmart used to have morning meetings. And we have to go to those morning meetings, and the job of the store manager was to fire everybody up, get them excited, get them dancing, do whatever else, and then tell them, this is what we're going to do, right? This is what we got to do. And the whole spin was to get them excited, they want to be involved with the mission of what the store was supposed to do. I'm sure Food Line does the same thing, I guess, right? Yeah. And so Paul is saying, look, these people are working with me. They're co-laborers with me. They're fellow workers with me. And so I'm just going to name a few. And you tell me if you recognize the names. Romans 16, Priscilla and Aquila.
Yes.
Anyone remember those? How does Paul meet them? Anyone remember?
Weren't they tent workers?
Yeah, they were tent workers. And
they were having a prayer meeting or...
Yeah, Paul was of the same trade as they were. He had connections through that. He met them. Now, does that mean that Paul actually trained them and helped them to be saved? Or were they actually already saved in their first place and God just kind of brought them together? Yeah, God brought them together, right? So they were co-laborers with Paul in that way. Now, 1 Thessalonians 3:2, it's Timothy. Who's Timothy?
Eunice's son.
Yeah, Eunice's son. And Timothy is Paul's son in the faith. He's someone that, they believe that Paul actually led to the Lord, but Timothy became someone who would travel with Paul on his missionary journeys, and then he actually became the pastor of the church of Ephesus, which is a church that Paul planted. And Paul sent him there as a young man because he believed that he could handle the church. And Paul, 1st and 2nd Timothy is giving Timothy all these things to think through as he's doing these things. So, Timothy is a co-laborer with Paul. Who's Epaphroditus? Can you imagine having the name Epaphroditus? What's your name? Epaphroditus. How do you spell that? Name's not the name of your kids today, Epaphroditus. I don't remember Epaphroditus right off the top of my head without looking at the scripture reference, but he's listed as being someone who's a co-laborer. And then Euodia Syntyche. They're also listed as being co-laborers with Paul. We don't know much about them, but he names them specifically as being that, right? And I think he even talks about how there's a quarrel between them. He goes, you need to get over it and get back to the work you're supposed to do. So, Paul is talking about these individuals who aren't sitting there so much listening to him, but they're working with him in these different churches and stuff. And he calls them his team, his co-workers, right? And then there's others. There's others like Apollos. Who's Apollos? Anyone remember Apollos? He comes speaking the gospel, but he doesn't know the full extent of it. So Priscilla and Aquila take Apollos and teach him more in depth. It's not Paul who does it, it's Priscilla and Aquila, but Paul's talking about it, right? And he gets better at it. And then Paul mentions later, well, Apollos is going to go over here and speak when he feels like the Lord is leading him to do this. So Paul's talking about the work of God and another individual who's a co-laborer with him, and Epaphras and Tychicus and Archippus. I don't know if I'm saying the names right, but these individuals Paul is identifying by name as working with him. There again, he's emphasizing this team concept. Now, what is the implications of that? Think about it. What are the implications of that? What is the church supposed to be? Is the church supposed to be, how can I think of this? Are we just one big lump and we're all the same, no differences between us, and no distinctions between us, and the church consists of one person?
It's supposed to be a body.
It's a body, right? Because this is what they say on page 115. Theologically, the implications are that this isn't an expression of the character of the church as a body with many parts. So practically and strategically, this is what they're saying in the book. It provides support. It provides refreshment. It provides a sharing of the burden and the multiplication of effective gospel work. Okay, so those are the implications that they're addressing in the book. This is what this is implying that this concept brings about. Now, fast forward to the church here today, right? And it doesn't have to be in Mount Holly, just in general, the church today. What does that mean for us? What should it mean for us?
That we work in unity with our different gifts.
Yeah. We work in unity with different gifts. We are a part of a team. We're part of a bigger team. Excuse me. This is what I wrote. I said, it is the body working together to see the work of Christ done, because the truth is that no pastor should attempt the task of ministering to a congregation on his own. And my statement to that is, do you agree or disagree?
Agree.
A pastor shouldn't do it on his own, right? Why not?
It's too much.
It's too much. I mean, but the mindset has been predominantly in years past, oh, that's what he's supposed to do.
That's what he's paid for.
That's what he's paid for. He's the professional clergyman, or he's the whatever, and then, but what happens? What happens if the pastor attempts to do it all on his own? Burnout is number one. Ineffectiveness is number two. You stall out as a church. You become not unified as a church because he can't be there for everybody, right? And so, some people will eventually say, well, he's not there for me. Well, he was there for me. And you start seeing divisions occur within the church. And so there becomes a lack of unity. And at the end of the day, it's like, oh my goodness, what's happening? Well, because he's not designed, no pastor is designed to shoulder the ministry by himself. Many try to do that, and it doesn't work. So what are some of the things that others could be doing along with the pastor? It's not just the role of the pastor to share the gospel. Others can do it too. Wow, imagine that. You can share the gospel with somebody if God puts you in a place to do so. You can train somebody else, on how to share the gospel or talk about that, how to work that out. Those things can be done by others. We don't have small groups here at Mount Holly, but if we did, others could lead small groups, right? Sunday school is kind of like a small group. We could have different leaders leading the Sunday school classes. That would be a good thing, right? Others can follow up with new believers. If someone comes to church and they become convicted and they get saved, and it's great if the pastor follows up with them. I think he should. But is it the sole role of the pastor to follow up with those individuals? No. It's encouraging actually for others to follow up with them because they feel like they're then part of the family. And if you don't know how to follow up well with others, and those who are good at it can train others to do that, right? Give them insight on how to do so. Here's one that can be a little difficult. How about visitation? How about visitation? A lot of people will say the pastor's the only one who should do visitation. You know, what if the pastor is running to the church, forgive me, what if the pastor is running to the hospital 3 times a week and someone else gets sick? And all of a sudden he's got to do a 4th visit, but then all of a sudden he can't do his sermon stuff for Sunday. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen then, right? It becomes very difficult. So is it okay for others to visit people in the hospital? Absolutely. Is it okay for others to call and check on them? Absolutely. You know, it's part of the family dynamic, right? Hey, you've not been here or you're sick. I'm concerned. How you doing? Nothing wrong with that. What about working with youth? What about working with kids? You know, should that be the pastor's responsibility? Or can others do that as well? You know, it's like I told, Dennis isn't here, but I told him one day, I said, I can't be back there and up here at the same time unless I'm cloned, and you don't want that. Right? So you know.
Back there and you're up here.
What?
So now he's back there and you're up
Yeah,
here.
yeah. So you know, it doesn't work that way. You know, how about this, meeting one-to-one with individuals? You know, meeting one-on-one with people just to help them with things or to walk through things with them. You know, can other people do that besides the pastor? Absolutely, they can. And it would be a good thing for them, not to replace the work of the pastor, but to supplement it. That's good things, because what does that show?
Love, care, and concern.
Love, care, and concern. It's understanding the work of the church, right? The greater purpose of it, the vision of it, all those things. But there again, what has been the mentality in the years gone by of how the church functions?
It's the pastor's job.
It's the pastor's job to do that. And so, you know, according to page 116, there's a principle that could be drawn from this, and this is what they say. The best way to build a congregation full of disciple-making disciples is to assemble and train a band of co-workers to labor alongside you. So there's the implication there of training people. You know, how do we train people to do these things? Or more importantly, how do we select people to do those things? How do you think we should select them?
Those 3 things, their character, their, whatever those other 2 things.
Yeah. Yeah, there's, you know, I'll word it to you this way. Should you select someone to train to be a co-worker in the gospel if they don't have a heart for God?
No.
Why not? They're an able-bodied individual. They got a car. They can, you know, why can't I just say, you know what, brother, I want you to do this? Why shouldn't I do that?
Because their witness is not going to be very strong.
Right. Okay. Here's another one. Should you seek to train someone who doesn't have a hunger to learn and grow? Now, there's a lot implied in that. Should you seek to select somebody, I can't talk, who doesn't have a hunger to learn and grow?
How can they train somebody else if they don't?
Well, that's true. That's a good point. If you have a hunger to learn and grow, what's that also mean about you? You have to have a degree of humility too, right? You have to be teachable. What's it mean to be teachable?
Open-minded.
Open-minded. So if I'm working for Scott one day and he's trying to teach me how to do something and I say, I don't care, and then I swing and knock a hole in the drywall, what's Scott going to say? Man, he's worthless. Right?
He needs training.
he needs training, but he won't listen to me, right? You know, and so you've got to have someone who's hungry to learn, wants to learn, but also is teachable. And there's patience required for that, right? There's patience tied into that. And, you know, they got to have a sound conversion experience. You know, you want somebody who that when you're seeking to look for someone to train to be a vine worker with you, you want them to be able to articulate, this is how I got saved. Because can you imagine that person, you know, hey, I'm going to ask Bev to come alongside me and be a vine worker, and she's out talking to someone one day and they say, well, hey, Bev, how'd you get saved? And she goes, I don't know.
I haven't been.
But, you know, I mean, but think about that. You know, then they're going to say, well, how can you tell me? Right? How do you know? You know, you know, You would want someone that's got a degree of maturity in them, someone who has lived the Christian life for a while. Because how does that help to be a vine worker, to have some experience in life? To have a little bit of Christian scars on your body,
You also want to
maybe.
be a good model.
Yeah.
Person for.
Yeah. You know, someone who, the Bible talks about, you know, bringing somebody in to I don't know if it was with deacons or I think it's deacons and stuff. They talk about don't bring someone in who's a new convert for a reason. Because you bring someone into a new convert to a position of leadership and they start facing the fires, what are they going to do?
Run.
Dear God, what have I signed up for? I'm gone. You know, they have to experience a degree of Christian living and the difficulties that brings, so that when they approach serving in the church, that they're prepared somewhat, right? And then, you know, you want someone who's faithful. You want someone who's faithful. You know, is it a good idea to say, hey, I want to train you to be a vine worker with me? And you say, hey, how about you meet every Monday night for the next 6 months, and then they never show up? How faithful is that? And why wouldn't that be good? You can't rely upon them, right? You know, so that's not a good thing. So you know, they list a couple blunders in the book. They say, don't do this. You know, when you're seeking to train people, number one, don't compromise on core beliefs and values. So what would that look like? What would it look like for someone to compromise on core beliefs and values, and why would you not want to select someone like that? Yeah. So someone, what is one of the core beliefs of the Christian faith?
Christ alone.
Yeah, Christ alone. So you're saved through Christ alone, and someone's in your church and they come up and they say, you know, Pastor, I really want to serve, but I really think that it's not just through Jesus. There's other means you can get to heaven. And I would hope at that point in time your alarm bells are going off in your head. But why would you not want to have that person co-laboring with you?
That's what they're going to train someone else to do.
Yeah, they're going to bring heresy into the church, aren't they? And then when they bring heresy into the church, they're going to say, well, the pastor let this guy come on board or whatever, and that can create some problems, right? And so someone who doesn't compromise on core beliefs and values is also somebody, you want to look for somebody who knows how to rightly handle the word of truth. The Bible speaks about that, right? It also says, don't be impressed by flashiness over substance. What does flashiness over substance mean? What does that look like?
You have a head knowledge, but not a heart knowledge.
Yeah.
You can say a whole lot and not say anything at all, too.
Yeah. It could also be someone, well, I've been in this church my family's been in this church for generations. Great. Do you know anything about it? Do you know anything about the gospel? Well, no, but I've been in the church for generations. Well, great. You know, do you know anything about the Bible? You know, can you help me? Can you articulate things, right? You know, or I'm a wealthy person in the neighborhood, in the local economy. So this person to be serving in the church, you know, I've known of churches who had deacons or people who are on leadership teams, and the only reason they're there is because, number one, they're well known, and number two, they're wealthy businessmen. What's the problem with that?
They want control.
They want control and they don't know anything else, right? What were we saying? It's a country club, right? Look at who we got on board here. Well, they're about an inch deep and a mile wide, but hey, they got some flashiness to them. Where's the substance at? So you don't want to look for that. You don't want to ignore somebody's track record, you know. You don't want to choose those who are not good at relating to people. I mean, it's important to know how to relate to people, right? You don't want to recruit in desperation. What does that mean? What does it mean to recruit in desperation?
Just get somebody in there.
Fill-
Oh my goodness, we've got a spot to fill. How fast can we fill it? Who's the first living body we can put there? Well, you know, why is that a big mistake? And it is a big mistake.
It might not be there.
It might not be their calling. It might not be their gift. You know, they could be a new convert, perhaps. They might not be saved at all. You know, you don't know anything really about them that much. You know, so you don't want to throw somebody in there and just say, you know, have at it, right? Why do you not want to select someone who's unteachable? I spoke about this a little bit earlier. Why? What does it look like to be unteachable? Let me ask that question.
They already know everything.
Yeah, you already know everything. You know, well, the Bible says this. Oh, I already knew that, Pastor. Well, great. But the Bible says, oh, I already knew that, Pastor. Well, great. Well, the Bible says this. No, you're wrong, Pastor. It's like, hold on. You know, let's work these things out together. Her pastor at her church, when I was first began training to be a pastor, I asked him a question one day. I said, when someone comes up and questions you about your sermon, how should you handle it? And you know what his answer was to me? Fantastic answer. Can you guess what his answer was to me?
What?
Hey, I am so glad you brought that to my attention. Let's do this. You go home and look this up in the Bible, and then write me out about a 3 or 4 page answer as to why you're right and this is wrong, and we'll sit down and talk about it together. And he said, you know what? You'll never hear from him again. You know, and I thought to myself, like, man, that's kind of harsh. But at the same time, if someone's unteachable and you're calling it out in that, you know, you kind of deal with it, right? Now, if they go home and look it up and write the pages out and come back and have a conversation with you, then have that conversation. Teach them. Let them teach you. That's a good thing, right? But someone who's not open to that, man, you know, that can be a big mistake, really big time. Choosing yes people. Why are choosing yes people bad?
They don't know how to say no.
They don't know how to say no. You know, if a pastor has a staff around him and he's surrounded him with people who will only say yes to what he says, okay, eventually that's going to pop, right? And then the yes people will hurt the situation even more. Here's one, calling for volunteers. You know, it might be hard to understand what this means and understand why it's difficult, but, you know, calling for volunteers it's not like the pastor shouldn't get up there and say, hey, we're looking for volunteers to fill this position. It really needs to be, as I've encouraged Bev to do, hey, go talk to people individually, right? Go seek out people who look like they can do these things well, you know. Ask them to consider it with careful thought and prayer instead of just saying, we're looking for someone to fill this position. Because, you know, serving concerns a whole lot. And so when those are the blunders, those are the things not to do that the book mentions. Can you think of any others? And you may not. I think it's pretty comprehensive. But can you think of any other things you maybe shouldn't do? If you think of any, let me know. But how would he train individuals then? You know, the number one thing in training somebody, and I like how the book puts it, is that you are inviting them to give up their lives for the service of Christ. Do you remember seeing that in there, Linda? Inviting them to give up their lives for the service of Christ. You know, they say this on page 120. We're not asking people to contribute to a little club that they happen to be a part of, as if we're trying to find someone to be the secretary of the local junior rugby club for the year. We're inviting people to join us in the most significant work in the world, the work that God is doing to gather people into his kingdom through the prayerful proclamation of the gospel of his Son. So I want to ask this question. What does it look like to give up your life for Christ? And I'm not talking about getting saved. I'm talking about a Christian. Helping them to understand what serving Christ really looks like. What does it mean to say to someone, you're giving up your life for Christ?
Christ is first.
Yeah. It's his will, not ours. And that can be hard, right? Sometimes. What else would it mean?
That he's the priority.
Yeah, he's the priority. You know, missionaries, when they're called to go overseas, what are missionaries called to do? Sacrifice. Big time, you know. If you're called out of your church to go plant a church somewhere and you go miles away to do it, you're giving up your job, your family, your home, all those different things to go plant a church somewhere. That can be difficult, right? But, you know, if God's called you to do it, then, you know, he's called you for a reason. You know, so And when we understand what it means to give up your life for Christ, you're basically saying, Jesus, you take the reins, right? You're taking the reins of my life and leading me into the direction you would have me to be. And so as people are willing for that to happen in their lives, and it doesn't mean that you totally, but please don't understand what I'm saying. You don't give up everything. I don't think that God asks anybody specifically to say, you know what, just give up your life and go be a monk or a nun somewhere. I don't think he's asking that. I think he's asking you to be willing to do whatever, right? To do whatever. Then as he shows that to you, okay, do that. So, and so as more and more people are trained this way, and as they are trained to minister this way, what's going to happen, at least what they say, and I believe it's true, is that the number and variety of ministries are going to quickly get out of hand, and people will be starting things. They're going to be taking initiative. They're going to be meeting with people, and they'll be dreaming up new ideas, and growth happens just like that, right? I mean, think about if God was leading Bev to do something. She's standing up, so I'm going to pick on her for a minute. What if God put it into Bev's heart to say, all right, what's something you like to do, Bev, other than watch football? Read. Yeah, okay. Let's just say God puts it on Bev's heart. Hey, what about a reading club at Mount Holly? He could, couldn't he? Right? It doesn't have to come through the pastor. It could be coming directly to you from God. And Bev says, you know what? I want to do this, but how can this happen? And she would come to the pastor and talk to me about how to implement these things, and we work out a plan, and she begins it, and lo and behold, people start coming. Imagine that. Does the pastor have to be there for the reading club? No. I can be there some. But you see, how could that build and be a good thing? It could, couldn't it?
You can send me your book recommendations.
And that's just that's learning to be attentive to God's direction in your life, and you taking a step in that direction for the purpose of spiritual growth of people, right? That is Bev being a co-laborer or a co-minister with myself. That could be true of anybody. And it doesn't have to be directed by the pastor. The pastor is equipping for the saints of the work of ministry, not doing all the ministry by himself. Because I promise you, there's things that God does not let me do because he wants other people to do it. No matter how much I sit there and try to brainstorm sometimes and say, what can we do? It's a blank. And I'm like, okay, I can't think of anything because I think there's an idea out there floating around in somebody else's mind that they just haven't either heard or listened to yet. Henry Blackaby, Experiencing God. You remember that? Anyone remember experiencing God? Ever done experiencing God? Okay, so Blackaby talks about that he went to this little church in Canada that was struggling, and he basically was going through stuff like this. And he said, it was amazing. He said, you would get into a business meeting and talking about people being attentive to what God is leading them. And the emphasis of his study is, where is God at work and how can we join him there? So where is God at work? And he would just put it out to the congregation. Where do you think God is at work and how can we join him? He didn't throw out any ideas. He didn't toss anything out there other than the fact of that statement. And he said, it was amazing because someone over here would say, well, the school down the road's doing this. And I've kind of wondered in the past, maybe we could do something to help them. And then he said, someone over here would say, well, you know what? That's been on my mind too. And I've got this thing that might help out with that. And then someone over here would say, well, you know what? Since you brought that up, that reminds me that I got this. And Blackaby said it was amazing because all these connections began happening. People with their various abilities and talents were coming together to do what? It wasn't the Trellis work. It was the vine work, right? He said it was awesome to see that happen. And that's what they're talking about here. So in chapter 10, they move forward. It says, what makes people worth watching for ministry? So in other words, how does God raise up people who are pastors and maybe other fellow workers? On page 127, it says, by what means or through what agency does God call and raise up the next generation of pastors and evangelists? And the first thing, before we get into that, the first thing we got to understand what that looks like. And I mentioned it before. You know, we've seen those races in the Olympics where you have the relay race, a baton passing race. You know, I can never do that. You know, because you got to be in sync. Those guys are running really fast, and they got to have their hands in sync so that when that person brings that baton back, the next person grabs it, right? Because if you don't grab it and you drop it, what happens? You're disqualified. You can't finish the race. So when we're passing the baton on to someone else, right? There's a degree of preparation in that. So, you know, Paul tells Timothy, I mentioned Timothy earlier, in 2 Timothy 2:2, and what you have heard from me, Paul says, what I've spoken to you, what you've heard, in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Paul's talking about passing the baton. You have to be training others up, you know. And so what does that sound like? What does that sound like in the church? Same thing we've been talking about even here, training and discipleship, right? You know, and so when we think about that, then why is it not just, why is it the job, why, I can't talk, forgive me. Why is it the job of the church and not just the job of someone else or the seminary? You know, churches oftentimes will say, well, it's the job of the seminary to train people. It's the job of someone else to train people. They just need to come here and serve. Now, why is it so important that the church be the one who raises up people for these things? And to understand that, let's talk about calling for a minute. If you read chapter 10, what did they call calling? How is it defined? What is calling? It's not picking up your phone and calling somebody. It's not Debbie calling Scott and saying, where are you? Right? Scott said, I don't know. What is calling?
It's a feeling that you are wanting to do something.
Yeah. It's that feeling in the back of your mind, there's something more, right? The hair standing up on the back of your neck a little bit, you know. So we want to distinguish something first. All are called to serve, right? We're all called to serve in some fashion. But then there's some who are called to be set apart for different areas of service. And that would be your two categories. That would be your elders or your pastors. And that would be even some of your fellow workers and ministers. So, you know, why, for an elder or a pastor, why is it important to understand the calling means for them? Would you want somebody who says, I've never been called by God to preach, but I'm willing to do it? Why wouldn't you want someone like that?
Well, God calls it.
Yeah, God calls them.
to
Yeah.
you to him. You know, it's
Yeah.
not your call, it's God's call.
Yeah. You know, so it does present a tension a little bit. We can say, well, okay, well, I'm called to serve, but how are they called to serve differently? Well, we're all called to serve together, but the pastors do things a little bit different, right? So when we think about this idea of what I'm talking about, calling here for pastors and then your layperson, it's found on page 132. This is what they say. The key thing seems to be that some are set apart or recognized or chosen, right, because of their convictions or their character and competency, and entrusted with the responsibility under God for particular ministries. This entrusting will happen through human processes of deliberation and decision, but it remains a solemn divine trust, a stewardship of the gospel for which we are answerable to God. So a calling is a sense of there's something more, right, that God is asking me to do, but how does it work? How does calling work? Well, to understand how they talk about it, and also biblically, I believe, is that God is the one who initiates the call. God is the one who leads in that calling part of it. But then others recognize that calling in the individual. You know, the others will see in that person, as they said in the quote on page 132, they'll see their convictions. They will try them and see what their convictions are. They will understand their character over an amount of time. They maintain a degree of character, and then their competencies. So, in other words, what that means is that God leads in this idea of calling, right? And then men recognize, or the congregation recognizes that calling in an individual. So, you know, let me look at this.
On that page 133, I had questioned that because he said there are some who are called directly and dramatically by God, like Moses and Elijah, but it is not a matter of discerning an inner feeling. I thought it was a matter of discerning an inner feeling.
Yeah, I think what they're saying, it's a middle section, that the Bible does not speak, let me back up. They say in the earlier paragraph, whatever the reason, it is common to wait for someone to say to us that they feel called to the ministry, or that they think that God is calling me in this particular situation to be a missionary before we start to assess their suitability. So in other words, we don't even consider somebody until they come to us and say, well, I feel called to do this. And the moment they announce I feel called, then we start evaluating them. What they're saying in that second paragraph is the Bible doesn't speak in those ways. Search as we may, we don't find in the Bible any example or concept of an inner call to ministry. And what they should have said there was without us people seeing that on the outside. Because they're talking about like Moses and Isaiah, they were called, you know, they had this dramatic scene in their lives, this dramatic call. But what happens, what they're, you know, those are select individuals. What happens, what they're trying to say here is that as we are looking at the congregation, we ought to have our eyes open to people who have the potential. Does that make sense? And so as we're seeing people who have the potential, and God is leading us to say, hey, you know, I'm going to look at Scott, and he seems to have the conviction, the competency, the character to potentially be a good leader, right? You know, maybe a deacon, elder, whatever. I'm just picking, you know, a great Frisbee golf player, I don't know. All those different things. And he's got the potential, so I'm going to start watching him to see how God leads. And then I may even talk to him and say, hey, how do you feel like God leading in your life? And if Scott tells me one day, well, you know, I feel like there's something more. Well, guess what might be happening? That might be the door that God's opening. You know, that's what they're talking about there. They just didn't word it very well. But, so you know, that is a very real potential. So, you know, but what is so strong about calling? If someone says, I'm called by God to do something, and they really have been called by God to do something, what's that mean about them? Do you think they're going to give up easily versus someone who's not called? But what's the difference, right? If Scott feels called to be something, he's going to have that inner drive. I can't get away from this. God is pushing me in this direction. As much as I would like to say, no, I don't want to do this, he's not going to be able to do this. He's going to be like Jeremiah. I want to shut my mouth up, right? But it burns inside of me, and I got to open my mouth and speak. I mean, Jeremiah is one of the greatest examples in the Bible of God saying, I called you before you were born to be a prophet for a purpose. And Jeremiah, at one point in his life, bless his heart, says, I don't want to do it anymore. You remember that?
And Jonah.
And Jonah. Right. And so Jeremiah says, I even stopped on purpose, and God would not let me get away from it, so I had to speak. That's what calling kind of implies. You've got to do it because there's no getting away from it. God called you to it. Now, you know, that's why you want to make sure someone feels called to it, right? Because if they're not called, they'll say, I give up and go. Now there's two errors that we can fall into when it comes to calling. Number one, we end up creating two classes of Christians. Those who really work for the Lord, and then the rest of us. And then the second error that happens, according to what they're saying in this book, is that we try to correct the first error by baptizing all forms of work as gospel work then. And how does that happen? That's a little confusing, but what do you think that means? Everyone's called to do vine work. Everyone's called to, you know, life transformation in other individuals, to pour into their lives. So we're all called to do those things. So we really can't differentiate and say there are two classes of Christians, right? But when that happens, and we say, well, okay, here is Pastor so-and-so over here, he's doing this work, but as long as I'm over here just being faithful in my vocation, that's enough. Is that necessarily true?
Oh my God, I want you to do that.
Yeah. I mean, when we think about, being faithful in your vocation, what does that bring up images of? Let's say you're a house painter, that's your vocation, and you're faithful in painting your houses, right? So you go out there and say, I'm going to paint the house, and I'm going to paint the house well, and I'm going to do a good job, and in the whole process, I'm not going to say anything about Jesus, I'm not going to try to be a spiritual witness, I'm not going to do anything, but as long as I'm faithful to my vocation, then that's good enough. What's wrong with that statement? That's not good enough. We're called to be a witness, right, in some way. So we don't want to create two classes of Christians. There's not those who are, if you say a pastor is called, then he's the one who's really called to the work. We're all called to the work. He's just called to a specific ministry in the work, right? The equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. This is what it says on page 139. Secular work is valuable and it's good, and it must not be despised or downgraded, but it is not the center or purpose of our lives, nor the means by which God will save the world. We will not save the world by being good house painters. Our primary identity as a Christian is not that I am an accountant or a carpenter, but that I am a disciple making disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ. So you be a faithful accountant, you be a faithful carpenter, you be a faithful whatever, but in the midst of your job and your vocation, and in the midst of where you're at, you work with the people who are around you. That's what we're called to do, right? Because here is what the Bible says. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of what?
God.
Word of God. How do people come to faith? They've got to hear something very important, and what they need to hear is from the Word of God. If it's never spoken, if it's never referenced, if it's never pointed to, they will not come to faith. There's a combination there, right? So, what could be some things we could look for? What are some things that we could say, like we would look for in someone to say, God may have a calling on an individual's life? I'll use Scott again as an example, just because I want to, no particular reason. If I'm looking at Scott, and Scott has not quite recognized that God has a calling on his life, but I'm looking at him, what are some things, according to this book, that I can look at to say maybe God's got a calling on his life?
He might be a good communicator.
Yeah.
That he could, or his faithfulness.
Yeah, faithfulness. He can be faithful in his understanding and commitment to God's word. He's teachable, right? He understands and he wants to learn more. Blameless in his reputation and his example of godliness. Gifted in their ability to teach others. Proven in their ability to lead and manage a family. Now that's important, right? Because if you can't lead your family well at home, what, according to the Bible, can you not do at church? You can't lead the church, right? That's what it says. I read it the other day. People who can communicate. Linda said that. If someone knows how to be faithful in their vocation and they're a good entrepreneur and they know how to run a business and stuff, that can be right? Someone who's a natural leader. And here's a good one. Someone who has the potential to reach a particular group that maybe, someone else in your church cannot reach. If we had a Hispanic couple come to church and they loved Mount Holly, they were saved individuals, and they joined the church, and they're just like, you know what? We want to be faithful to God. We're studying our Bibles, and they have all these qualifications, and they're just kind of like, there's got to be something more for us, Pastor. What do you think I would say to them? You have an open door ministry to other Hispanics, right? That would be a natural step for them. that could be someone that God would be calling out of Mount Holly to be serving in that particular area. And so, you know, that's a good thing. You know, and so here's some further questions that we can ask if we notice people with these characteristics that we just mentioned. And so the question that I have is, why are these so important? Here's a question we can ask. Is he or she genuinely converted and able to articulate his faith in Christ? Why is that important? I said it earlier.
Because you're going to be sharing your faith with others.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to make sure they're saved. You want to make sure they can explain to others why they're saved. You know, is he reading and asking questions about the Bible and theology? Why would that be a good thing to see in others?
She wants to learn.
Yeah, I want to learn. Teach me. Teachable attitude, right? Is he or she faithful in applying the Bible to his thinking in life? Application is important, so why would that be so important? They're not just hearing it on Sunday, they're doing it throughout the week, right? Doesn't mean they're perfect at it. No one's perfect at anything. But you know, when you see people who are genuinely trying to apply and they're learning and apply, you can say, okay, they get it. And I firmly believe that when people get it and they're trying to do that, God says, I'm going to open the door for greater things. And that can be scary sometimes, but it happens. Is that person humble and teachable? If someone's not humble, what problems can that cause?
Turn off people, be arrogance, you know. You know it all.
Yeah, so what is the lack of humility, right? Is someone faithful and trustworthy? You know, I was listening to a story the other day online, and it talked about this guy he's a pastor down in Texas now. His first name Josh. I can't think of his last name. Do you remember who it is, honey? We and I both listened to him.
Lakeview?
I think so. He's a younger guy. Looks like a younger guy. I don't know.
I know you're talking about.
But he was saying, he goes, I was a young man, felt like I had the calling to ministry, and I had a lot of questions. And he goes, so I go to this pastor, this church at this time, and I asked him, I say, can I sit down to lunch with you one day and just ask questions, because I would like to know. And the pastor says, sure, get with my secretary and we'll pencil you in. And this guy was so busy, he said it took 2 years for this lunch to happen. Well, number one reason is because he wanted to see if this boy was serious. And so 2 years go by, and the boy faithfully shows up, and the pastor's there, and they sit down for, I think, 2 to 3 hours, he says. And he asks every single question he can think of, and the pastor gives him all the answers that he wants, and he leaves, and he's coming through the church or whatever, and the secretary says, do you know what the pastor just did for you? And he was like, yeah, he just had lunch with me and answered all my questions. And she's like, do you know what date this is? And it was like 3 or 4 days after 9/11. And so this pastor, being the pastor of one of the bigger churches in the area, had been asked to speak to hundreds of people at a gathering. And he said, I can't do it because I've got this commitment with this young boy.
Oh, wow.
And the young man said, I never forgot that, because he kept his word. You know, he kept his promise. He was faithful and he was trustworthy, right? So why is that so important again? Why is it important to be faithful and trustworthy? Keep your word, for example, and to, you know,
Because God
dependable.
is faithful and trustworthy. We should be faithful and trustworthy.
Yeah. You
Maybe
know,
you have to be a good example for that person, otherwise they're not gonna trust or believe you.
yeah. Well, I mean, just the main fact that he's talking about that story had an effect on his life, right? And so he's looking back and saying, man, this guy took time out of his schedule. He put aside a bigger event that he could be a part of to pour into my life. And from there on, he's like, I'm going to try to live up to that. You know, that's what her pastor did for me when my dad died. I mean, I didn't know her at the time, but he took some time to talk to me and my mom about my dad going through the things he was going through. And when I left out of that meeting tonight, I still remember to this day, I looked at my mom and I said, if God ever calls me to be a pastor, I want to be like him. And that's true, right? Because he took the time to do that, you know, and the answers he gave were, you know, not your cardboard answers. They were something I never thought about, and it was good. Is there any past or present sin that could bring Christ's name into dishonor? You know, if someone has a hidden sin in their life, or maybe they got something that's out in the open, is it a good idea to say, hey, you want to come and be trained to be a co-laborer? You may have to address that sin. Why would you want to address that sin? The testimony of the person, right? If you don't address the sin, then, you know, people are going to say, what does that church stand for?
It's gonna hinder their ministry.
Yeah, it's going to hinder their ministry, You know, if Mount Holly does not address sin in the church, but people in the community see it, what are they going to say about Mount Holly? They don't really practice what they preach, right? So, does he serve, or does he or she serve others without being asked? Do they have a servant's heart? Do they do any kind of work at evangelism? Are they a natural communicator? Do they show leadership? You know, are others following them because of their particular ministry, if they have one? Do people respond to their leadership in a positive manner? There's so many things you can ask. You know, they even look and say, is their family life healthy? You know, is there some hint of problems there? You know, does he relate well with others? Is he emotionally stable and tough? You know, sometimes that's hard to know without talking to somebody, right? You know, so it implies the need for a relationship here. Can that person face criticism, disappointment, and failure? You know, all these things are good things to ask about others who might be, God may be working to call into ministry in some way, or to be, you know, calling to a specific thing. Now, this is just what the book recommends. I went word for word out of the book. I don't necessarily agree with them all, but it does point to the fact that we should be looking for good character traits and qualities, which then I think acts as a good foundation. I can't read my own writing. To assess whether they are called. Now, again, I ask the same question. Why is that so important? Why would you want to have these things as a foundation when considering others? If I'm a pastor and I'm looking to train others up, why should I ask these questions? Or should I ask these questions?
Well, because, like they said, your character, your conviction, and your conversion matters, how you're going to witness and proclaim the gospel.
You're a representative of, you're representing God.
Yeah. But think about
You
how,
gotta walk the walk.
think about how Paul called Timothy. He said, I'm entrusting to you the things that you've heard from me in the ears of others to pass it on to other faithful men. He says faithful men on purpose. He doesn't say just any old man. He says faithful men. He's telling Timothy it's important to do this because you're not going to be there forever. You might die tomorrow. Heaven help, don't want that to happen. So we've got to look for those who have the character, conviction, and the competencies to do the things that God has called them to do, those who possess that foundation so that that can be built on, because ultimately the thing is you can't do it yourself. As a pastor, you can't do it yourself. You know, there's got to be some sort of preparation for the passing on of leadership. You know, Sunday school teachers, you can't do it yourself. You know, there ought to be in Sunday schools this idea of one day if I can't do it anymore, who will take my place? Who has the character, convictions, and the competencies to do these things? You know, most of our Southern Baptist churches, not all, but most are made up of the baby boomer generation. What is the age range of the baby boomer generation? Anyone know? They were born after World War II, so that kind of gives you an idea. What's happening to the baby boomer generation? They're dying off. Who's going to replace them? Those who have character, conviction, and competencies. You know, so we're looking for those things, right? It's necessary to do those things. I'm going to stop there, but anyone have any thoughts or comments they want to add or questions? Maybe? Man, I must have did a really good job, no question.
You have been doing a very good job.
Yeah. So here's a question they ask in the handout that I printed off. If all Christians are called to serve Christ, and we are, if we're all called to be vine workers, and we are, what is different about those who pastor and lead a congregation and your average layperson? The pastor is called to be a vine worker. The layperson in the pew is called to be a vine worker. What's the difference between the two?
Not a lot.
Maybe training.
Yeah, pretty much it's the pastor is the preparation for the work of ministry, right? He's to train others. He's to lead spiritually. He's to do those things, but it's training others to do the work as well. Let me see if there's any other questions that stand out. For someone who is in full-time ministry, let's say someone's a missionary overseas and they're in full-time ministry, or they are pastoring a church plant, that you would say that's a recognized ministry, right? That is a person who's doing that for their living. But then you have a Christian who is a librarian at the local library, right? And they are faithfully serving in the local library. What do those two have in common? If they're both faithful, what do they have in common? What do you think they would?
They're disciple makers.
Yeah. The person at the library is working to be a disciple maker in the library, right? The person in the mission field is where they're at leading people in the mission field to do the same thing. You know, cogs in the wheel, two different things, but really the same ministry in a sense. Okay, that's all I got for questions. So ask again, any thoughts or comments or questions or anything you want to add? Bobby's not here tonight, so it's quiet.
I think one thing I got out of the book too was when you're dealing with training, is like, do you train, you've got several levels of discipleship persons, and you've got like Don and Sarah, well, I think, these two are a little bit further along than the other ones. Well, who does the pastor want to focus on? These two weaker ones, or the stronger ones who can?
I think the answer
The stronger ones, so that they can go.
help the weaker
teach
ones.
the weak.
Yeah. Yeah, because that was kind of the idea of like, you know, who do we have, where are they at, and then the ones who are the stronger and more mature, you can focus on them so that they can then multiply themselves with the younger ones also. So, and that's interesting too. Anything else?
The harvest is plenty, but the laborers are few.
That's right. And you know, do you think Jesus was looking towards the future and seeing us today and going, wow, the laborers are few? He was looking at his day and time too, wasn't he? But what does he say? What does Jesus say? Pray unto the Lord of the harvest. How did he finish it? He would send laborers into his harvest. You know, he will raise up people to be co-laborers, you know, in the church, for the mission of the church. And sometimes you just gotta ask. All right, any other thoughts, comments? I don't want to put anybody short. I'll go ahead and turn this up.